I want to do my non-fiction roundup for 2016. Um, I don't think I've read quite as much non-fiction this year as last year because I've been reading extensively for the Republic of Consciousness Prize for Small Presses. But the non-fiction I have read has been extremely good, especially these four. Without a doubt, the most extraordinary piece of non-fiction I read this year is Secondhand Time by Svetlana Alexeyevich, winner of the Nobel Prize. And this is published in this country by Fitzcarraldo Editions, one of my favourite small presses. Secondhand Time is a very compendious book of accounts of the post-Soviet Russian experience, ranging across whole age groups. There are 90-year-olds, people who served in the Great Patriotic War, as it was called, through to KGB agents, through to younger people who barely even remember the Soviet Union. The key thing about this is that it absolutely reframes and recalibrates how we think about what the experience of the Soviet Union was in the kind of souls of the Russian people. That they believed they were participating in history. That they were on a journey towards a greater freedom. And that the post-Soviet experience is one of emptiness and a lack of vision and a lack of historical purpose. And as no other book has done that I've ever read, it makes very clear that having something to believe in, or believing in something, is intrinsic to our contentment as human beings in a way that the accumulation of goods can never be. And so when we look back on the Soviet experience from the West, we imagine that the liberation is somehow complete, when actually Western capitalism, market capitalism, has shorn away something very important to what it meant at that point to be Russian and part of that historical journey. In a sense, what's interesting about this book is it's a sort of multitudinous set of accounts by ordinary people, whereas my second non-fiction book, which is the enormous first volume of 6, Robert Caro's The Years of Lyndon Johnson. This starts in the late 19th century and finishes just after World War II. Lyndon Johnson, it is the most extraordinary book. Lyndon Johnson is the most extraordinary character. His energy, his instincts, his willingness to operate within the American political system and see every angle and see every opportunity in each person he meets kind of narrative, and both use, manipulate, and kind of reward them. It's extraordinary. I mean, he is a man of such ridiculous, ambitious appetites that he is an unstoppable force. And I will read volume 2 next year. But in terms of, when we think of 20th century politicians, we think of Stalin and Churchill and Hitler and Mussolini and Franco, and if it's the Americans, we might think of Kennedy or Nixon, maybe Roosevelt. but Lyndon B. Johnson is the absolute apogee of what it is to be a politician in the 20th century, without the sort of, in a sense, I mean, he's part. I mean, he doesn't kick off the Vietnam War, but he accelerates it. But he essentially wasn't, he wasn't president during the Second World War or the First World War. He didn't kick off a war. He wasn't, impeached or anything. But he is absolutely the most extraordinary politician in American history. It's enormous, Volume One, but just it's also a history of America as well. Thirdly, Architecture's Odd Couple, which is a sort of kind of popular history of Frank Lloyd Wright and Philip Johnson. Frank Lloyd Wright, absolutely, a genius. No one can argue about it. He completely fulfills my definition: invention plus influence. But what a cranky individual. I mean, sort of truculent, arrogant, manipulative, vain, egotistical. But then you just look at those buildings and look at the development of his buildings, essentially ending with the Guggenheim Museum in New York, which was actually built just after he died. But I didn't actually know much about Philip Johnson. I thought I liked his buildings more than I do, because actually I'd always been misled that he built the Seagram building. He designed the Seagram building, but of course that was Mies van der Rohe. He was just the working architect, the official architect, because he had the license in New York. But I do love the Glass House, which is the house he built for himself in 1947. And I think I love the Glass House more than anything that Frank Lloyd Wright built. But I would live in Falling Water any day. But what's interesting, I didn't realise that Philip Johnson's career started off as a sort of journalist, then sort of designer, journalist, curator, designer. He became an architect much later in life. He was absolutely enthralled to Mies van der Rohe, as he should have been. But it does seem to me that the moment he adopted postmodernism, he in the early 1960s, and sponsored various postmodernist architects, he built some of the horriblest buildings in America. The AT&T building is just awful. There's that awful double thing in Texas. There's ones in Pittsburgh. They're just awful. And they're huge. But it's a very, very funny book, because the two of them are just at each other all the time. One is in his 80s, one is in his 30s, or 70s and 30s, and so one is one is going to eventually usurp the other. But in the end, actually, Philip Johnson is a gentleman, in the sense that he even though he was treated fairly brusquely by Frank Lloyd Wright, he understood his debt to Frank Lloyd Wright, and when he was in Frank Lloyd Wright buildings, he just he knew that there was a man way beyond his talent operating. And so it's a warm-hearted book because of that, I think. But yeah, it's if you're interested in architecture, it's a good book. And then finally, the book I chose to read after my father's death a couple of weeks ago, and it's kind of odd. You kind of go, he'd been given 3 weeks to live, and he lived 3 weeks in a day. We weren't particularly close, but he's had a pretty big impact on my life. and it was kind of what did I choose to read the night he died, and I chose this, String Theory by David Foster Wallace on tennis, and it's a set of 5 essays that David Foster Wallace wrote about tennis, all of which I've read before, apart from the one on the extraordinary, sorry, I can't remember his name now, the extraordinary Roger Federer, who's my favourite tennis player of all time. They are just so engaging and amiable and funny and fiercely intelligent. And it doesn't even matter if you don't like tennis, because it's just, there's a sort of transcendental quality to just the precision and genius of Foster Wallace's prose, which I find much more convincing in his non-fiction than his fiction. But you know, the first essay on tennis is about him he was an okay junior tennis player, but he you know, he played in the Midwest, and actually the essay is really about the weather in the Midwest and how you play tennis in it. There's a brilliant essay on sports biographies and how and why sports people, when they talk so inanely about you know, about being at the very top of their profession, doing things that, you know, that make them sort of superhuman, and their descriptions of what happened on the court or whatever seem to be, the, you know, banality exemplified. There's a brilliant essay on the qualification round of an Open championship. And then there is the essay on Federer, which, you know, he just sort of demonstrates in his prose the sort of, I don't know, what was it about Federer? It was grace, power, grace again, finesse, power, and then grace again. No other sportsman has ever done that, and David Foster Wallace captures it, and so it's just fantastic. If you like tennis or sport and want to actually read something sensible and intelligent, brilliantly intelligent, this is the one for you. So they're my 4 books, non-fiction books of 2016. Thank you.